Hello, my name is Ryan Hughes, and today I'll be sharing a paper I wrote called What is Slavery? Third grade student sense making about enslavement through historical inquiry. And I'm with the Department of Teacher Education and Higher Education at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And this paper is forthcoming in Volume 50, Issue 1 of Theory and Research in Social Education. The project context for this study, it occurred during the 2017 to 2018 school year in the classroom of a teacher named Ms. McKinley. And Ms. McKinley was a veteran teacher of 27 years at the time of the study. And in her third grade classroom, she devoted sizable amounts of time to teaching social studies. And in addition, she used historical thinking concepts with her students. And so that's what made her a compelling classroom to research from my perspective. And the participants in this particular paper were 19 of Ms. McKinley's students that school year. During that school year, Ms. McKinley taught 3 social studies inquiries. They included an inquiry on immigration, forced immigration, and migration. And she planned these inquiries using the inquiry design model. And each inquiry lasted about 2 to 3 months. And they were heavily integrated with literacy content. This paper in particular focuses on a subset of one of the inquiries, the forced immigration inquiry. You can see students research the compelling question, how does oppression force people to move to a new place? And I was particularly interested in how students develop their conceptualizations of slavery during these two when they were researching these 2 questions during the inquiry. What is slavery and how is our country divided during the Civil War? Right around the time of the study, Learning for Justice, an anti-biased educational organization, was researching how slavery is typically taught in American classrooms. And they issued a report in 2018 called the Teaching Hard History American Slavery Report with their findings. And they summarized 7 key problems. The first problem is that teachers tended to overemphasize abolition rather than enslavement, that we typically provide a progressive view, only acknowledging flaws to the extent they have been solved. We tend to focus on enslavement as a Southern institution rather than acknowledging the ways that slavery influenced all aspects of US culture, politics, and economics. There tends to be limited teaching about the relationship between enslavement and white supremacy. And then there's sometimes reliance on pedagogy that's poorly suited for the topic, such as role-playing or role-play simulations. That it's rare for teachers to connect slavery to the present, and that there's oftentimes a focus on white historical actors' experiences rather than those of enslaved people themselves. To bolster teaching about slavery, the Teaching Hard History report recommended the use of 10 key concepts that were developed by Ira Berlin in 2016. These concepts taken together are designed to give students a robust understanding of enslavement. I've summarized them briefly there for you on the left. So I essentially became curious, how would Ms. McKinley's students' work compare to the concepts in Berlin's framework? So I asked 2 research questions to make that comparison. And in addition to relying on the Teaching Hard History report, I also relied on some relevant literature in social studies education. This included existing literature about teaching enslavement in US elementary schools, as well as disciplinary inquiry and history. My data sources for the study included students' classwork, and it was about 155 pieces of classwork total. And to understand what students thought before and after instruction, I gave them a pre and post concept map to complete that looked like this, where they could write or draw the responses to the compelling and supporting questions. And in addition, classwork included things like social studies, journals, as well as graphic organizers students completed when they were analyzing or comparing texts. And in addition, I did interviews with 8 focal students about their maps before and after the inquiry. So here are the findings. You can see at the top there that the red represents inclusion of the concept before the inquiry began, and then blue represents inclusion of the concept during the inquiry, and purple represents after the students finished the inquiry. At the bottom there, you can see the 10 key concepts from Berlin. And I was really interested in this first code, institution of power, because you can see that there were a lot of students mentioning this at the beginning of the inquiry, but also that there are many students who are mentioning it at the end. In fact, this was the only key concept that all of the students included in their post-concept maps. And I was also interested in this concept of race. You can see that there are quite a few students mentioning this in the beginning as well, and then quite a few students mentioning it, the tall purple bar at the end of the inquiry. So looking into those two variables, I was interested in student sense making. So to start with power, what I noticed is that students definitely included a more complex understanding of power over time in their classwork. And they typically would write about slavery through the lens of an enslaved person's experience. So here's an example of a piece of classwork from a student named Emily. And this is actually her post-concept map. So this is what she created after the inquiry was over. You can see she drew some illustrations there. It says master, overseer, whip. And then when I interviewed Emily, here's what she said to describe the image on the left. Slavery is like people working, only Black people had to work. There was an overseer, he would whip you if you wouldn't work. The slaves had to work in the master's house. So if we think about what Emily's describing around power, I would pull out these sentences. So there was an overseer, he would whip you. Slaves had to work in the master's house. So it's obviously clear that she's writing a lot about power and violence and forced labor in this entry. But again, she's making sense of it through the experiences of what an enslaved person might go through. And so because there's so much attention to the interpersonal level of experience, there's limited attention to systems and structures of power. And this pattern was prevalent across the students' work. And then in addition, I saw some instances where the students would actually misconstrue power as punishment based on enslaved people's misbehavior. So we see that in this sentence, in Emily's example again, there was this line, he would whip you if you wouldn't work. She's talking about an overseer. So we can see the use of if you wouldn't work makes it seem like enslaved people were basically responsible for being whipped because they weren't doing what they were supposed to do. So I saw that as a misrepresentation of power within these interpersonal dynamics. When I went back and kind of dialed it on student sense making about race, I found that when students were including race, they were oftentimes just using racial terms. And that when I did more analysis, I found that students were 7 times more likely to name African American or Black than they were to include whites in their artifacts during the inquiry. And in fact, a total of only 5% of all the students' classwork mentioned whites at all. And students accomplished this through the use of the passive voice, which was a way to obscure white people's thinking and actions. So again, we can see in Emily's concept map, when we think about race, she's got this term Black people in her first sentence. Slavery is like people working, only Black people had to work. But she uses words like overseer and master and never really mentions the race of the oppressors. And I started to try to conjecture about why there was such limited sense making about the oppressive social actor around whites. And one of the things I noticed was that a lot of the text students read, informational text, used the passive voice. So for example, here is an article students read called Sailing for Freedom. And if you look at, there's a sentence I just picked out, they say things like a group of Africans was forced aboard the original ship. The Africans had been kidnapped and their owners were taking them to work. So there's no information here about who's actually doing the forcing, the kidnapping, and the owning, yet they're using the term Africans multiple times. Here's another example of a book students used during the inquiry. And you can see another example here. Hundreds of people were chained together. So use of the passive without any information about who is doing the chaining. So this type of pattern was very prevalent in the students' writing as well. So in the discussion of the paper, I just said that the inquiry may have solidified the idea that racism is caused by individuals, such as the master or the overseer, rather than by social, political, and economic structures. And so the way that slavery was discussed in the classroom may have limited the students' understandings of racism in the present, including white people's responsibility. And that in order to improve upon this, Ms. McKinley should think about making visible and rejecting institutional and structural forms of racism. And finally, just that she could consider connecting the past through discussions of the past to the present more through discussions of how systems of oppression and labor exploitation continue into the present. And for resources that teachers might use who want to take on teaching slavery in this particular way, there is learningforjustice.org. That is the Teaching Hard History American Slavery Framework, as well. There's the Since 1619 Project and the Howard's in Education Project. So these are three resources I included in the paper for teachers looking to teach about enslavement through a lens of systemic and institutional oppression. And with that being said, thank you very much for your attention and for viewing.